any of these other tunes, just go home and play a slow walking blues for a really long time. Don't try to do anything fancy rhythmically. Just focus on the pulse and the beat, and make sure that every note relates to the chord the way you want it to. Make sure you're hearing every note. And if you're not hearing it, slow it down even more. And basically I did that for 2 weeks. I pretty much did only that for 2 weeks, just play slow walking blues.
I had such a great time connecting with today's guest. He is such a cool artist, bassist, and composer with over 80 album credits. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are featuring Chris Lightcap. What a cool player. He's got 6 albums of original music. He has made Rolling Stone's Best Jazz of 2019 list. And yeah, what a cool person. We dig into his early years, his circuitous path through the music world, his appearance on the Burning Ambulance podcast. I do try to link up to other podcasts when we talk about him, so there's some context, and much more. Definitely check out his albums, SuperBigmouth, the group. Follow him on Facebook and Instagram. And without further ado, let's get into this conversation with Chris Lightcap. What is that mic?
It's a company that doesn't exist anymore called Sound Deluxe.
Oh, okay.
They made now it's David Bach microphones.
Oh, cool.
Same guy who I don't know if you've heard of that company. They do like Neumann copies like everybody else. They're really good though.
Nice.
I bought this mic from another bass player, Ben Street.
Oh, wow.
Many years ago. So it's good. It's like a copy of a FET 47.
Okay. And do you use that to record
bass.
the bass? Okay, it's a good bass
but it's
mic.
also a great vocal mic. I mean, for talking.
Yeah.
I don't need a great vocal mic. It's way better than anything I would need for voice, but it's, if I'm in a studio, I prefer a regular U47, original one. But I can't afford that.
Right.
I don't have $10,000 lying around. So this is a FET 47 is sort of like, I wouldn't say it's the next best thing, but it's a good option if you don't have like a nice one of those 2 Neumann style microphones available, or a nice ribbon mic. This is a good second choice.
Okay.
Like this.
I'm always curious because like I don't do any recording of my bass except once in a blue moon. I've got a Zoom H6, which I use for like mobile podcasting, and that sounds fine with my bass. But I'm not like recording albums or anything. So right. But people ask me like, what's a good bass mic? So that's that you dig that.
Well, everybody has a different opinion about it, but yeah. I mean, if I'm in a studio in New York City, most of them will have a U47. Yeah, which is just like. That's
the classic
Sinatra mic.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I think of.
He toured with his own. It was a Telefunken, same company though. So usually, if you're in even a semi decent recording studio these days, you're usually pretty spoiled with the microphone options. Yeah. Because that's most good studio owners know that's the first place to invest their money is in good mics. So, yeah, that or else like some nice old RCA ribbon mics can sound great. Okay. Or a combination. Usually people, if you have enough time, most engineers will like to put like 3 microphones on you.
Oh, really? Okay.
I mean, in my experience, they'll like, yeah, let's try this one too. Just be, see what happens, since we got it, I'd like to get a balance between the 2 sometimes, but usually the U47 wins. Where
have you had the U47 positioned? I love these sort of geeky things because I go in and I've done a couple classical recording sessions here and there, or some contemporary music, but very little. Like, are you going low on the bass or low and close or what? I
used to, in general, with microphones, ask people to put it lower, and then I realized it wasn't. I wasn't getting a very good sound.
Really? Okay.
This is a while ago. Yeah. But I think for the last 15 to 20 years, I've been pretty aware that on my bass, and it's pretty much right in the center, maybe slightly favoring the G side. Okay. Depending on the room, depending on whether you're in a booth or in a room with baffling around you, or in the room. I mean, you're rarely in the room with other instruments without any separation. Right. So that's pretty much dead center at bridge height. Okay. Is where I start. And if we need to move it a little bit, we will. Okay. And I try to be respectful of the engineer. Sure. And what they're used to doing, because even if you're sure they're wrong for your practice, whatever you're used to. The last thing most of them want to hear is like, no, we gotta take it from me. I mean, because they have the power to ruin your sound.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you might win the battle but lose the war, right?
Exactly. Although most engineers wouldn't do that, but you just want to have a good working relationship in general. So I try to be as diplomatic as possible.
Wow. Okay.
Not that I always have been.
Right.
Again, learning by error. What's the phrase? Trial by error. There we go.
Right. Sure. I understand.
Trial and error, not trial by fire. Trial and error. There we go.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. Wow. Do you do a lot of, and by the way, I have absolutely no structure or format for any of these things. This is just cool. I guess we're going, but we can edit. I have folks that help me edit everything. It's just like, I just think of it as like, we're just having a coffee or a beer together or whatever.
Great.
So
cool.
I have no set things, but I love when people have, so I was just like, brewing kombucha and making pizza dough and listening to that SuperBigmouth which is awesome. And and then you also, I love when people have been on other podcasts, which you have, because that's like, so I was puttering around and listening to this, I think Burning Ambulance is and I forget who the host
Freeman.
Yeah, that was a great, he does a tremendous job on that. That was really,
he's great. That was a really fun conversation because he had a whole different set of points of reference from your typical, it was not like a typical jazz podcast. Or like it wasn't, he's not coming from the perspective of a musician. He is a journalist, he's a writer, but he's not a straight up jazz guy. He's into like all sorts of music, and he's written about all kinds of music. And I can't remember, he's Stereo Gum, I think is the magazine that he writes for.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure which. He's the jazz writer for Stereo Gum, and he does some jazz stuff. But I think he's just got kind of like a very interesting cross section of interests that have gotten him in and out of jazz, in terms of what he's focused on as a writer. And so it was so funny because I think one of the points of reference that he got into like 5 minutes in the conversation was like a, not Helmet, but somebody sort of more avant than Helmet. Somebody I'd never checked out. And he's like, oh yeah, you got to check this record out because they mix the drums right in the center. We were talking about drum.
That's right. Yeah, it was really interesting. He was talking about the Tool, like latest Tool album. It was Tool. That's what it was.
I said, man, I don't think anyone's ever going to ask me about Tool ever again in an interview. I couldn't say I knew any. I mean, but I said, yeah, I got to check that out, so.
Well, but that's what's fun. That's what's fun about getting the different perspectives. There's a guy here in the Bay Area, Andrew Lyon, and I'm 99% sure I'm getting his last name right, but he does a podcast out of the California Jazz Conservatory. There's the bass teacher there is named Jeff Denson. I don't know if you've ever run into him or not, but Andrew makes me realize like what a terrible podcaster, especially in the realm of jazz, that I am whenever I listen to anything, because he is like done like 50 hours of research, I think, on everybody that he talks with, and it's just one of those like, it's like the most like kind of like that Burning Ambulance podcast a little bit, but yeah, it's always interesting though, the different. And then another one that I love, I don't know if you have ever listened to the No Trouble podcast.
No Trouble?
Yeah.
I don't know if I've heard any of their podcasts, but I did an interview with them. My second to last record, Superette, when that came out. They have an interview with me up.
Oh, cool.
They're really cool. I like that. They're as bass websites go, they're pretty hip.
They're good people.
They cover a lot of people really under the radar. And
yeah. You must not have been. The podcast is called Groove, and I didn't see your name pop up on there, so maybe you weren't. But the guy that
I didn't do their podcast. No.
Yeah, the guy that does it is named Mitch Joel, who's a really interesting. He's actually a public speaker. Not sure how that's going in the pandemic era, but he's also a bass player, and so he comes from this really interesting, again, journalistic kind of background with people. But Corey Brown, who started that site, and Kevin Johnson, who does a lot of the interviews, they're both friends. We hang out at NAMM and that kind of thing. And
yeah, Kevin's the guy who interviewed me. He was super cool.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I had a really nice conversation with him.
Nice. I'll go look that up. That's great.
If you want.
Yeah, I know, for sure. For sure.
You have some minutes to kill, as most of us do these days.
Well, so here's a question I have asked people, like, what were you planning on doing July 2020? I'm assuming probably not what you are doing.
I had a bunch of gigs in Europe canceled with a bunch of different bands.
Yeah.
Throughout this whole thing, and it was a drag, but there's worse problems to have.
Right.
And we're all dealing with it in our own way and being as resourceful as we can. Luckily, everybody's safe and healthy at the moment, and counting our blessings. I live here in Brooklyn with my wife and 2 kids, and it's been a very interesting adjustment dealing with the home learning.
Oh man.
Reality.
Yeah. I can't even imagine. We don't have kids, but I'm looking at my friends that have kids and just like talking to them about the challenges and frustrations. And it's not like the teachers are ready to adapt to that either.
No, I mean, we're all completely flailing together, teachers, parents, kids, and my kids are older. So it's not, they're a little more self-directed at their age than it would. I've talked to some people who have kids who are much younger than mine, who are like kindergarten and first grade, and they're just like, oh my God, it's such a struggle. And it's so stressful because 1 year, like 6 months at that age of no learning, can really have long-term repercussions for the future. And, so it's just, and it's interesting seeing my own kids though, and how they've been able to adapt in their own different ways, being the 2 different ages. One's 10 and one's 14. And one is the 10-year-old is a naturally very organized kid. And so at first he seemed like he was going to be the really easy one, because he had already as soon as he found out about it, he was typing out a schedule for himself, posting it on his wall, deciding what he's going to do and what subjects he was going to be working on. But then we realized, okay, he's getting everything done really quickly. And then what is he doing when he's done with his lessons? We realized he's just like watching hours of YouTube videos after he finished his lessons. What are you watching? So I'm like, oh God. Okay. So, and meanwhile, I'm like trying to get my 14-year-old who is in high school, and it's so much harder for him because he's got 7 different classes, 7 different teachers, 7 different ways of communicating. There's like 3 or 4 different ways that the teachers at his school have to communicate with the students. And he's missing all of it because after a certain point, it just becomes so unmanageable, to try to keep on top of everything. So assignments are getting turned in late and not done at all. And luckily, I think a lot of people were dealing with the situation. And so the teachers were really as cooperative as they could be. They were really great in terms of how they were handling the situation. And the Board of Ed eventually stepped in and made it. I don't think it's going to be exactly a very high stakes year for these kids. Yeah, in terms of the grades. So that at least is kind of not an issue. But I think, now we're all wondering what's going to happen in the fall. I mean, now we know what's going to happen in the fall, and we're all kind of dreading it because either some parents are either just completely freaked out about their kid going back to school at all, and other parents are like, my kids have to be back in school 5 days a week or I'm going to kill myself. Yeah. So so they're doing something in between. So no one's going to be happy. It's going to be, it's continuing. It's an ongoing thing.
Well, I live in the city of San Francisco, so we've got a very similar situation. And again, no kids in the Heath household, but I had been going and once a week going and teaching at my local middle school. Going in and doing orchestra related things, and so keeping in touch with them, it's been interesting. And I have a whopping 1 student who's I believe 16, and just watching this poor guy navigate all these different school related things, and then oh my goodness, like music, like watching these music teachers, and it's not like life was like real flowing perfectly anyway before all this happened. It's not like it was the tightest running ship you've ever seen. Just in terms of just education, certainly in San Francisco. And so, boy, it'll be interesting. And they have not released exactly what they're planning. So,
well, now that New York has said what they're going to do, I think that being that it's the biggest school district in the country, now that other schools are going to be, I think we're going to see something similar.
Yeah.
or more draconian. They're going to have to be in other areas of the country,
right,
where the flare-ups have been worse. Yeah, I mean, the one good thing about the music thing, well, my older son is at a music high school. He goes to Edward R. Murrow High School, and he's a trombonist, and he has 3 periods of music. And the music teachers were all really good about doing lots and lots of in-person live classes. And they were just having them practice like together, at the same time and share whatever ideas they were working on. And he ended up practicing so much during the day because it was part of his structured day. And he became I think just through his classes, because he wasn't taking private lessons this year because we were waiting to see if he could adjust to the school year. And he just was working on all this material that they gave him. And it was probably the highlight of his day that he was getting to do these music classes and preparing for auditions for whatever bands he's going to be in next year. Assuming they'll be able to actually play in the same room at some point. But that ended up being the best part of his day. And I think something that really helped structure his day and made it a lot more tolerable.
Yeah.
Because it's a great music program at that school. It's kind of like LaGuardia.
Oh, cool. Okay.
It's very comparable, except for it's more like LaGuardia, but with a regular high school as well.
Okay.
So we'll see though, I also have one student.
We're in the same boat.
He's 14.
Okay.
And he's actually a bass player's kid, a really accomplished bass player's kid. So the pressure is not lost on me. He's a friend of mine. It's like you can't teach your own kids.
Right.
Most people can, and I think even when it's going well, it's not ethical. Like it's never going well for the right reasons,
right?
And it's usually not going well. And so this guy's smart enough to know that. So I've been teaching it, and he's practically a total beginner. He's been playing a little bit of electric bass and just starting on upright. He also is going to be going to a music high school next year. So it's been really fun to have usually if I get students, they're usually, college students or people moving to New York trying to be professionals and they want to study, more advanced conceptual things, or they want to study composition. And we usually end up just sitting around talking most of the time.
Yeah. Right.
But it's been interesting. Like I love having a total beginner student. It's really, 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 gratifying to just be able to always have something very concrete you can address and work on and just start very methodically and slowly and build a foundation. And some people don't like having beginning students, but I've discovered that I really, really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's something I have kind of fallen in love with as I've gotten older. I used to not like it. I used to think I was not good at it. I probably wasn't good at it. And
I'm not saying I'm good at it, by the way. I just can't enjoy it. I'm probably ensuring he'll never play again. After this year, he's done with bass.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, sorry, go on.
No. It's just interesting. And I've actually grown to really enjoy working with adult beginners, which were actually like my least favorite people to work with. And again, it's basically because I didn't understand. I understood what a 15-year-old who was in school and playing bass. I understood like the goals. Oh, you're gonna audition for Allstate. You're gonna eventually audition for colleges. You got your playing exam. You got your summer festival. And the adult motivations were a lot more mysterious to me when I was like 24. But it's really actually been fun. And there's nothing like working with a really dialed in adult beginner, who's going to go and like go down the YouTube rabbit holes that I suggest and really work on the things. And progress is different, but that's been uniquely and surprisingly satisfying these last few years.
Yeah. And it also reminds me of my own, that whole thing. It reminds me of me when I actually started playing double bass, because I didn't start playing till I was 17.
Oh,
and
okay.
Because I started on violin, and the difference between me, I started on violin when I was 9, and then I started teaching myself bass guitar when I was 14, and then I got into jazz and wanted to start playing double bass and classical music when I was 17. So by the time I was 17, I was so ready and to be so serious about the instrument that I had chosen. This is what I'd chosen. This is what I'm interested in. This is what I want to do. Whereas violin, I was the worst violin student. I mean, my parents had to cajole me into practicing an hour a day, and I hated it. I didn't hate the violin, but I almost hated the violin. Like, it was the kind of thing where I just didn't love it. I was like, oh yeah, okay, this is okay. It was like, it started out fun and like it was really kind of took to it relatively easily at a young age, the beginning stage, and then starts to get really hard. And I wasn't into classical music at the time. It just, all I wanted to do was sit around and listen to The Who. And like my parents, I didn't realize how lucky I was. My parents would take me to the Pittsburgh Symphony several times a year. Would be so bored by the second half, would they be playing the big workhorse, whatever they call it, the second half. Meanwhile, I'm hearing like Andre Previn and Lauren Mazel and Lynn Harrell and James Galway and people like that. I'm just like so bored. I'm like 11 years old. But then by the time I started playing upright bass, I'd gotten really into bass guitar, really gotten into jazz. And then not only was I getting into jazz, but I'd come back around to appreciating classical music more and more, to the point that my first teacher was just a classical bass teacher. It was Joel's teacher, actually.
Oh, who was
also interviewed?
Right.
His name was Bob Skavronsky.
Okay.
Robert Skavronsky, who was a local, he subbed with the Pittsburgh Symphony and played with like the Pittsburgh Opera and Ballet. And he also played with the Westmoreland Symphony, which was sort of a community orchestra that was the next county over from Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is, where I grew up. And so Joel told me about a great electric bass teacher, and then also told me about Bob when I started studying, when I got into upright.
So it's funny because we have a very similar background. I played violin, started at about 9 years old, switched over to electric bass at about 14.
Wow.
And it was
ding.
Yeah. And I picked up my parents wouldn't let me quit orchestra. I said I wanted to quit, so they said you can switch to bass. So I switched, and now I unlike you, I barely play any electric at all these days. But I wanted to play bass because of a metal band, and I don't know, what was it, jazz that drew you into the electric bass world, or I figured not, but yeah.
No way. Jazz was not on my radar at all. When I was 14.
Yeah.
I went to one jazz concert with my parents. My parents were avid classical music aficionados, always had classical music playing around the house, and some pop music and some Broadway and stuff like that, but tons of classical music. My mom played classical piano, kept studying with the teacher. My dad did not play an instrument. He might be tone deaf, but he's a huge music fan, and very instrumental. Both of them equally instrumental in me getting into music at a very early age. And my dad had been a jazz fan though in college. So he went through that whole thing where you go off to college and start listening to folk music and jazz, because rock and roll, which he was into, he was first generation rock and roll guy, graduated high school in 58. So he tells that proverbial story about seeing Little Richard video films and Chuck Berry films and Rock Around the Clock the first time it was in the theater, and Blackboard Jungle and all that stuff, Buddy Holly records. Then pop music became really boring to him, never became an Elvis fan. Just went straight into jazz and folk music when he went off to college. So all those records were buried away in his collection. They were just listening to classical music around the house. But then they had one Ella Fitzgerald 8-track they used to play all the time in the car, and they were huge. They were playing it all the time. And one day they said, Ella Fitzgerald's coming to Pittsburgh. We're all going to go in. And there was a free concert at the Point, which is right where the Three Rivers meet, right near where Three River Stadium used to be. And they would have concerts there in the summer. Like that was their big outdoor, that was like their Hollywood Bowl, for only a much more low key Pittsburgh kind of way.
Right.
And so Ella was playing, and there was a saxophone player opening for her. And I'm 99% sure it was Stanley Turrentine, who was a Pittsburgher originally. So I went, that was the only jazz concert I ever saw when I was probably about 11. And it was fun. I mean, I loved it. I thought it was really fun, but I wasn't just like, I want to play jazz now. I was just like, oh, cool. That was fun. Let's go home. We're tired.
Right. Sure.
I was pretty much just obsessed. By the time I was 10 or 11, I was just obsessed with old rock bands, classic rock bands. The Who was my band. I was just obsessed with The Who as soon as I found out about them. And then I got into, the Stones, and I liked the Beatles, but I wasn't super into them like some people were. Partly because my sister liked them.
Oh, sure.
I had an older sister, and she liked the Beatles and Bruce Springsteen and like soft rock, like Air Supply. So anything she did, I really, it was like, no, that was so. But I still would admit that I liked the Beatles, that I thought they were cool, and I later got really into the Beatles, but more as an adult. So there's like Jimi Hendrix, Zeppelin, sort of like classic hard-ish rock, and then early 80s metal like Iron Maiden and stuff. So by the time I started, I was 14. I didn't know that I was going to play bass, but I knew I wanted to play in a rock band. And when I was in 8th grade, my friends wanted to do this is really, really embarrassing, but my friends and I decided we wanted to be in a talent show, lip syncing as a lip sync band, like pretending that pantomiming. and the two songs that they decided we would do, I didn't really choose it, were Let's Go by the Cars.
Oh,
and Leave It by Yes.
Do you have any old videotapes of those performances? That would be fun to honor.
If I did, they would be long burned by now. So do you know the song "Leave It" by Yes?
Yeah, sure. I'm a Yes fan.
Whatever that record was that had the zip code record. It's not 90215. That was the TV show. 90215. 90210 was the TV.
90210. Yeah, exactly.
Got to get that straight. It's really important. So so they're like, well, we're going to play guitar. We already have enough fake guitar players.
Right.
One guy, JC, he was going to play drums. Because he was actually playing drums in the orchestra. And so another kid was going to pretend to play keyboard. So they're like, you're going to have to play bass. And it was just, oh, really? So I decided that if I was going to play bass, I was going to really look like I knew what I was doing. So I went home and I listened to those two songs, and I never really paid attention to what the bass did before doing that. And I heard the Cars song, and I'm like, okay, this is pretty simple, but I kind of think, and then I noticed already the bass wasn't just playing the most rudimentary part. They were, every once in a while he'd do something kind of interesting and melodic. Then I put on the Yes song, and I was like, what the hell is this guy doing?
Yeah, for sure.
I didn't know who Chris Squire was yet. I hadn't checked any of the early Yes stuff out. I only had was that tape, the cassette tape of that album. And I was like, this is all bass playing like this? Because he's like, right off the bat, he's just playing like this counter melody. It's like, dun, 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 dun. And so anyway, so that was the first inkling that maybe bass could be interesting. And then I realized, well, I was into the Who already, and I realized that a lot of the parts that I thought were guitar parts were actually bass parts that John Entwistle was playing, because he was such a godhead bass player. So all these connections were starting to come together. So by the time I was 14, I went from middle school to high school, and I reunited with a bunch of people that I knew from when I was younger, and restarted our friendships with them. And one of them was playing guitar, and this guy, Mike, and he said, if you play bass, we could get Eric to play drums, and we could have a rock band in his basement. And his tale as old as time, obviously.
Sure. Right.
so I'm like, okay, so I go home, and at this point I've been studying violin for 11 years. No, not 11, 6 years, 5 or 6 years, private lessons, the whole thing. And I go home, and my parents, who would not let me quit violin, I go home and I say, hey, I think I want to play bass guitar. And they just kind of looked at me like, okay. And so they just looked at me as if to say, go figure out how you're going to play bass guitar. Why are you telling us? So I said, well, I think, and I remembered my cousin Steven played bass. So I called him up. He's older than me, and they live in Philadelphia. And I said, Steven, do you still have that bass? You're still playing it? He said, no. And he said, you can borrow it. We're going to be there. We're going to be in Latrobe, which is the other side of the state from Philly. We're going to be there for Thanksgiving this year. I'll bring it. So my cousin Steven brought me his late 70s Fender Precision to have as my first bass guitar that I learned on. to my grandma's house where we were having Thanksgiving. I took it home that night, Thanksgiving evening, and I just started playing along with my boombox. And I was just, that's all I wanted to do. That was it. From that moment on, for the next 3 or 4 years, like every spare moment was spent just messing around on bass and listening to records and playing along. And as you probably experienced, going from having violin lessons and being told what to play and sitting in an orchestra and waiting for the conductor to tell you what to do and having to sight read and just putting on a record and playing along with it and learning the part and choosing whatever you wanted to play. It's so liberating, right?
Yeah, it's a very different feeling. Yeah,
especially
all of a sudden, it's like all the windows opened up. All of a sudden, yeah, exactly.
And you're 14, which is the age to want to do that. You're just getting really rebellious and frustrated. You know. So that was like that was it, man. I mean, and then the jazz. The more, you know, I don't know how close in age we are, but back then, for me, obviously, mid 80s, there was no internet. Yeah,
no, I think I'm probably the exact same.
Okay.
You know, I graduated from high school in '94, so
okay,
I'm close.
I'm 5 years older than you.
Okay, so we're the same general bracket. Yeah.
So my only lifeline to any kind of information, not having an older brother to tell me what records to listen to, it was like luckily I was already I had done my own listening, and I sort of had stuff that I was into. I had a certain sense of whatever taste I had at that point, and then I was listening to those records like Hendrix, Zeppelin, The Stones, Eric Clapton, Cream. And then I would go to the bookstore and buy guitar magazines.
Oh yeah,
like a guitar player, and also remember this one, Guitar for the Practicing Musician.
Of course, I have stacks of those probably at my mom's house still somewhere.
I wish I still had mine. There was some great stuff in there, and there would always be those transcriptions in the middle where they'd have the tab, and it was great for me because I couldn't really read bass clef yet, and so that was invaluable. And then that's when I started learning more about the more proggy, nerdy side of things, like Geddy Lee interviews, and then him talking about how much he loved Chris Squire, and who I was already starting to check out from getting into older Yes stuff, and yada, yada, yada. The whole thing kind of progresses the way it does for a lot of people. And and then that leads to Jocko and Stanley. Once you start reading those magazines and like history of rock and what music, whatever magazines, and you can eventually find your way to the fusion world, and then Jocko and Stanley. And I think the first actual jazz LP I bought was the first Jocko solo record.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Which I still have, because most of the records that I bought at the time were actually tapes.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was in the tape world too. I was in the Columbia Record Club or whatever. And I got my, monthly allotment of cassettes.
And CDs weren't really kicking in until I was graduating high school.
Yeah.
And they were so expensive.
Right.
And and then when by the time I got to college, I remember I discovered how cheap LPs were, and that's when I started buying a lot of records because they were cheaper. Not because I didn't know they sounded better yet. I just thought they were better, and also there was a lot of stuff that hadn't been reissued yet. So as I got more and more esoteric in my listening habits, getting into people like Roscoe Mitchell and Braxton and Henry Threadgill and people like that, I realized, well, none of that's on CD anyway, so I'm going to just buy it for $2 on LP.
Man, you brought up this kind of in that Burning Ambulance podcast. You were talking about like collections in general. I think you said you picked up some relatively decent stereo equipment recently. And I was thinking about that because I used to have a decent setup for listening and a collection, and all of that left when we moved to San Francisco because we were moving to a tiny place. And so I'm more of like the millennial or beyond, kind of like I got my Spotify playlist and everything. But man, do I miss, first of all, I miss my collection and building it up from, tapes to then CDs and LPs. And then I used to work back in college at the music library at Northwestern in Chicago. And I remember going through, we had this music library, the Deering Library, and the entire wall of the place was just nothing but jazz LPs.
Oh, God.
And I would just lose myself in there, just pulling out, I did. And I just think how different I can't even, the only time I ever look at the physical packaging is if someone someone sends me a CD to talk about on the podcast. It's just, but I remember even like in my metal days, like pulling out my Megadeth cassettes and unfolding them and looking at that.
Unfolding this thing, right. The cassette with like the accordion.
Yeah.
With all the lyrics on it.
Yeah.
I can never read those now.
Right. Me neither.
Yeah.
But just the idea of a collection in general. I mean, there's, and like going back to my treasured recordings there, I miss that. I miss that. You know, I've become such a digital person. Like I've got my iPad here, all my music's on it. And I miss that in my music too, like pulling out my old book and opening it up and looking, smelling the paper. And then I miss the actual experience of listening on good audio equipment. You know, it's got to change the way you experience music versus like these AirPods or my phone speaker or that kind of thing.
Yeah, listen, I mean, I was exactly the same way for the longest time. I got I had a pretty crummy turntable to begin with, but I had all these records. I worked in a record store, so
sweet,
and so I was always bringing home, you know, company discounts. It was a used record store to begin with, so I was bringing stuff home all the time, on CD and LP. But you know, as time went on, and the iPod came along, and people started, just like everybody else, I started just transferring all my CDs so I could carry it with me, and getting really into listening on headphones. And as soon as I started touring all the time, then that became my reality. It like just tuning out and listening. I used to do a lot of listening on the road and on airplanes and stuff. And then I'd come home and I wouldn't want to listen to music at all, because I'd be playing and listening to music all on the road all the time.
Yeah. And
then I realized, man, I really miss that. And I don't want to listen to music on headphones all the time on the road. I mean, I like being able to, but I don't. I just also don't think it was doing wonders for my hearing.
No, sure, I'll bet.
You know?
Yeah.
So that's something I really was wary of, being on a plane and you end up cranking it more. Oh. And I, you know, so I wanted to avoid that if at all possible. And I was really and you know, it's not about having like a fancy system, but something that sounds good when you're listening in space without headphones, or if you're going to use headphones too, with like a decent pair of headphones where it sounds good, and you're just sitting down and just listening to music. And I like listening to music in the background too, but I like having the option of being able to sit and listen to it and having it sound decent. And so my wife and I were rearranging our apartment, and at one point, and she said, you know, you have all these records sitting in the corner of the living room, and the turntable's not working. It'd be nice to like get a new turntable and maybe be able to listen to our records again and have them set up in a nice way. They're just collecting dust. It looks terrible. And I was like, oh, you want to get a new turntable? Okay. That was probably a mistake on her part.
Right.
Because then I can go totally obsessive about things like that. And I wanted to make it a goal to do it for cheap and buy old stuff, because I like old stuff. And I had this belief that I probably would find a lot of old stuff that sounded as good, maybe not the same, but as good, but different than the new stuff. And that's kind of what I was hearkening back to, because when I grew up, my dad always had a pretty nice stereo system. And I remember I had such fond, nostalgic memories of listening to music on these giant silver components that our parents had, you know, and these huge speakers that my dad had. I later asked him about it. I said, what was that stereo system you had at our old house? Because he eventually traded it up for something fancier. And he said, well, that was this friend of mine from law school that was a serious audiophile, and he was getting rid of his old system. He was getting all Macintosh stuff, so he just gave it to me. And it was like this old Sansui tube receiver and these giant speakers. I said, what are those speakers? I remember at one point I tried to plug my bass amp into it and I couldn't get it to work, but they looked really big, so I thought they'd be good. But he said, yeah, they had 17-inch woofers. Wow. These Japanese speakers. And I was like, man, you don't have them still, do you? He said, there's no way I have those. But he did get these Dahlquist DQ10s, which are some serious audiophile speakers from the 70s and 80s. And he still has those in storage somewhere. So I will never have a place big enough to hold these speakers. But they're like these giant, like planar speakers with 5 drivers in them.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I went online and Craigslist and eBay, and I managed to find some cheap components that sound really nice together. I got an old Fisher integrated amp and some old KLH Model 6 speakers and a Thorns turntable that I got for about $300, and spent a lot of time tweaking it and fixing it up. And so now it's so fun to go back and now to listen to. I feel like this is a cliche, but I feel like listening to a record like Something Else by Miles and Cannonball on Blue Note, on vinyl, on an even halfway decent system. There's no substitute for that. It's just another level of enjoyment. And yeah, of course you can hear more too. You can hear as a musician, it's so fun to just tune in that much more acutely to the relationship between the quarter note of Sam Jones and Art Blakey's ride cymbal. But man, it is the whole experience is incredible. It is Art Blakey, right?
I think so.
You better edit that out.
Someone will comment. Otherwise,
I will make you edit that
okay.
out. So it's something that I'm definitely glad I got back into. And then the challenge is like, okay, now that it's there, try not to obsess over it too much, and try not to sit around like, how did the speaker sound in this position?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Cause and I just don't have, I don't have time for that. That's the part where it can be like a little disruptive to one's life, especially if you have a family and bills to pay. And
I hear you, man. I've got
music to learn for gigs.
I've got to be very careful with my hobby. That's not really a hobby because it's related to your job, but something like that. As I look over there and I have like $8,000 worth of electronic music gear that I never use anymore when I was, because I used to teach an EDM class, or all my camera gear that I start to get into. And I always have to like check myself. It's like, okay, Jason, let's make sure that, so I have not kind of purposefully not gone down the audiophile rabbit hole yet.
It is something to be aware of if you're going to do it. Just to, if you have that kind of personality.
Listening, it's interesting. Like, so I for years have had a really hard time just listening for enjoyment. And I think it's so tied up in just like whatever the heck I do, that my job is, it's related to music. So I just think of that as work. So I do a lot of listening, but I think of it as work. But I've gotten more into it in recent years. And I don't know what part of it is. My wife got a more normal job when we moved out here. And so we've been going to more concerts, and it was really weird. We had a good 15 years where we never went to concerts. And unless it was like like a friend of mine's in town and he's playing, so I'm going to go. But we would never just say, let's go to the Chicago Symphony or let's go to the San Francisco Symphony. But we've started to actually become patrons and going to SF Jazz and actually just seeing concerts. And we've started actually, bizarrely, although it's great, listening to music at dinner, which we never did. But and so we've been listening to like going down, like a week of just like Ella and getting into Duke Ellington. I'm very much an amateur jazz person, but I know more than her. And so it's been fun it's been fun just listening for, without any real work intent.
I never want to lose the fan part of music. I will never, that would be a drag.
Yeah.
Of course it's great to listen to music to see what you can glean from it as a musician. We all do that. We've all done that. And I continue to do it all the time. But the reason that we play music, hopefully, is because we love it and it inspired us when we first heard it. We first heard other people doing it, whether we're listening to it live or on recordings. And we've been listening to music around the house a lot more lately. And speaking of Duke Ellington, I've been on a serious Duke Ellington just tear.
Oh yeah.
And
that's awesome.
I've come to realize I think he's like the most important American artist of the 20th century. Yeah. He's like America's Picasso / Stravinsky figure. If there is one, he's one of them. Maybe Frank Lloyd Wright and him. I mean, in terms of someone who had that kind of longevity to his career and also was at the forefront. I mean, whether you want to call him he was avant-garde basically for 50 years. And he stayed relevant, just like Stravinsky did, just like Picasso did. Like they evolved with the times, and they didn't just follow trends. They absorbed them, and then they set new standards within them, and they stayed relevant. And I feel like he did that. And he had periods where he kind of went up and down a little bit. Mostly it was just this constant ascendancy. And he did by the end, he was putting out like 10, 15 records a year.
It's amazing.
And it was all killing. It was all amazing. Like seriously on the edge of your seat, exciting, just dynamic, avant-garde, incredible music. And you can listen to any, especially the stuff in the 60s. You put it on, and you put on a Mingus record, you put on an Ornette Coleman record, you put it on Monk. Duke Ellington is not, none of them are outdoing him. And I mean, really, he's like a record like the Queen Suite. Have you ever heard that one?
No. What I was thinking of was the Far East Suite. That's the one that haunts me. That I ever since I discovered that, I think I discovered that in the 90s at some point. Mm-hmm. One of my CD buying spree, and I have those. I have that running through my head off and on. We
were just listening to it yesterday, actually.
It's incredible.
That second piece that starts off with the second movement. It starts off with a clarinet.
It's got this like really sort of bouncy. Yeah, exactly.
Yep. And then with the trombones. Who does that?
Yeah.
Who's ever done that? I mean, musicians know. It's not saying anything new. Musicians know, but I feel like the public at large still has not figured out how heavy he was. And like people, he's a household name, but it's like people know, oh yeah, he's that guy who wrote Satin Doll or Take the A Train. I love that. And maybe they know Caravan, but they don't realize what a stunningly important just artist he was, I think. And as a band leader, he was, so groundbreaking in the way that he would write for actual musicians always.
Yeah.
And even though the band evolved, the band was always, you listen to it, it doesn't sound like the way some people, the connotation that big band music takes on to most people. You listen to it, it doesn't sound, it's not like, it's a whole different animal,
Right.
Same thing with Count Basie too. When you actually listen to Count Basie records, if you forget all the high school and college versions of
that's the challenge,
which
right?
are great. Which is great that they do it, and they should do it. That's the most important music, and some of them do a great job at it. But no matter how you actually hear them originally doing it, it's like you're listening to Coltrane or like one of the great bands. Listening to Miles Davis's quintet from the 60s. It's like they're completely just dealing, and it's mind-alteringly good music. Yeah, so I didn't mean to go off on a Duke tangent, but because you said
that's what that's that's what this podcast is. I love.
The tangent podcast. No, the other speaking of going to see live music, the other thing that we've been listening to a lot is a lot of Bach, a lot of classical music in general, and I recently got a recording. I got a recording of the Brandenburg concertos that I didn't have on vinyl, and I put it on, and it sounds so good. And I was playing it around the house a lot, and not that much of a surprise, but my kids really loved it. And so every year, the jazz, the Society for the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, does all the Brandenburg concertos in one sitting. And I decided, I heard that, I didn't even know that they did that, but they were advertising on the radio that they were going to give away tickets. I didn't get the tickets, but I said, let's just go. Let's just get the tickets and go see them. And I got some pretty good seats right in the middle. And I took the kids. And at this point, my youngest was 8 and my oldest was 12 or 13. I guess they're 8 and 12. And I said, guys, we're going to a classical, and I thought about all the classical music concerts that I went to that I felt like I was being dragged to. And
for sure,
I was like, I know that you guys like this music, but it's not, you're going to be bored, but you have to be really respectful. And I think you're ready for this. And I really think it's something you're going to enjoy. And if you don't, we won't try anything like this again. But I've never seen any of this music, especially played by a group that like this, and that you were using all the correct, arrangements in terms of number of instruments and everything, and these world-class players. And so we went, they were transfixed the whole concert.
That's awesome.
They were into it the whole time. I was shocked. I said, I know it's good music, but, and it just goes to show you, if you, I don't know. I shouldn't have said anything, and maybe they would have enjoyed it even more, but just it was, just the enjoyment of getting to hear the music like that. They really appreciated it. I certainly did. And it's something that I always say I'm going to prioritize more, is going to see more shows. I always try to go see my friends play, but in terms of I want to take my family and take my wife out to see more shows. She's always begging me to go see more stuff, and we do, but never as much as we'd like to.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, but it's always time well spent, and it's got to be an extra challenge, obviously, with the kids. Although it's cool that they love it, and especially that Brandenburg performance. There's so many. It's so interesting because that's some of my favorite playing to do, is like playing, and I don't play on gut strings but I love that experience and the parallels, especially when you're really playing like in a A415 kind of setup. The parallels between that and jazz are so tremendous, it's like a combo up there basically. Yeah, and totally. There's improv, and it's its own language, and it's just fascinating. Well, a gig I was in Chicago 23 years before moving out here, and I played the kind of the big Messiah that would happen every year. It was A440, but it was Baroque stylings, and the other bassist was on gut strings and everything. A guy named Jerry Fuller, who incidentally,
I know who Jerry Fuller is.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Jerry's gotten really into playing jazz now, and he's just like, and
isn't he a Connecticut guy?
No. Jerry is in Chicago, but he's done things all over the place. Okay. So
I would see his picture up at David Gage's shop.
Sure. Yeah.
So I might be mixing up with another person, but I certainly know his name.
Yeah. But it's so interesting and how many people I've met that are into playing jazz and or period music and or contemporary music, and all of them have similarities because they're all like smaller ensemble. It's all a very different experience than being like in an 8-person bass section.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, and that was kind of, I didn't go to a conservatory. I went to a college with a music department. And so, and I didn't know that I wanted to be a musician when I went to college. I just started playing bass in the summer before my senior year in high school. Mm-hmm. So by the time I was actually enrolling in college, I went to Williams College in Massachusetts. I was at the point where I would have been ready to audition at some conservatories, maybe. Because I'd been studying very intently for a year and really like just practicing all the time. And Bob, this teacher that I hooked up with, had worked he was a really, really great old school, Pittsburgh German bow. He had studied with Tony Bianco.
Yeah.
And just got me start off on an amazing foundation, worked through the entire Simandl book, the entire book, beginning to end. And by the end, I think he gave me like a Marcello sonata to learn. He's like, okay, you can start working on this now. And then it was time for me to go off to college. So when I went off to college, I didn't know. I mean, I'd been playing in that same youth orchestra that I met Joel at when I was playing violin. He went off to CMU, and I started playing bass with one other guy. So I didn't know if I was really on the right path or not, but I knew I was practicing a lot. So I went to Williams. And they didn't have a very big music department, but they had a lot of resources. Like they had a great conductor. They had 2 amazing composition teachers, and they had a great bass teacher on faculty. Well, he wasn't really on faculty, he was an adjunct, and they hardly ever had any bass students though. So I just took advantage of whatever I could while I was there. But I knew if I was ever going to decide that I was going to be a serious orchestral player, I wasn't going to do it based on whatever I was doing there. I would have to probably go off and go to grad school or, take several years to do that. But I was always interested in jazz. I was playing as much jazz as I could, although there wasn't that much of a jazz scene there. I was interested in, like you said, it's very similar of contemporary music. Mm-hmm. And my teacher picked up on that right away. And he said, we could do the Bottesini, like I did like the Kusevitsky concerto, I think at the time.
Sure.
And I did the Hindemith sonata, and that was more in line with what I was interested in, although I wasn't that into that piece. And he said, we could do the Bottesini, whatever, but I just feel like you should just work on Bach. I think that's something you'd be into. So he had me do the Viola da Gamba Sonata, basically the whole time, number 2, the whole time I was in school. That's basically what was my big classical music solo project that I was working on, plus some contemporary pieces. I did this solo piece that was written for Bert Turetsky.
Oh yeah,
cool. By him.
Yeah.
By a local composer named Vivian Fine, who had taught at Bennington, which is 20 minutes away from Williams. And my teacher was also a composition teacher at Bennington. He was also a composer, my bass teacher. So I kind of basically cobbled together a music major that allowed me to do composition. I did a composition thesis. I did a senior recital playing mostly classical music and some jazz. And I was playing tons of jazz on the side, studying arranging, doing all the classical music requirements that were part of the major. And it was a pretty traditional major, but it wasn't a conservatory major. It was 2 semesters of history, not 5 like I would have had to do at NEC or, because it was, it's a liberal arts college. So, and so when I graduated, I'm like, well, all I want to do is play jazz. I'm going to at least move to New York and try that. And I figured though that in New York was where I could meet other like-minded people who were also interested in, other areas of contemporary music. And I was also starting to get really into Cuban music and I was still playing a little electric bass at that point, but not that much. I was just really, really focused on upright and getting further and further away from the classical side of jazz playing, like having started off like learning my thumb position relatively early and getting into guys like Eddie Gomez and Scott LaFaro, and kind of hitting the gears on that approach when I discovered Charlie Hayden and Wilbur Ware and players like that, and Sam Jones and Percy Heath. And, but having the freedom though, to choose what avenue I was going, it was kind of perfect for someone like me. If I'd been at a conservatory with a jazz program, especially, I feel like I would have been giving, I'm the kind of person that would have just been like, oh, what are you listening to? What should I listen to? And I missed out on all the things that a program like that would have had to offer, like playing all the time and still having to move to New York and get my ass completely kicked sure. And not knowing any tunes and all the things that I was missing in my playing that I had to get together. But I was the one saving grace of being in an environment like that is that I was still playing all the time, and I was free to check out, like you said, go to the library, pick out any record I wanted to. I was like, I think I might want to check out the art ensemble. Okay, I'll do that. If I'd been in jazz school, I probably would have been said, no, you should go listen to whatever. Yeah. Something good, but maybe something that, I'd be assigned to. Maybe that's all I would listen to. Like, well, I listen to my jazz for the day. So it wouldn't be the most self-directed thing for me, the kind of person I am, I know.
It's so interesting to look back at that time in anyone's life. Certainly, I've done that myself. I did a project. I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I decided to look at. I did a bachelor's and master's double bass performance, and both at Northwestern. And I decided. I guess I found my old college transcripts, or maybe I needed them for something. And I was looking. I thought, let's just go through and look at what I took in college, and then let's look at what I've done in my life, and let's see what correlations there are. Yeah. And it is so interesting. Like, oh my goodness, I wish I had played more piano, because for someone who doesn't play piano, I've played so much more bad piano, how desperately I wish I had that. Or, I've done a lot of conducting, way more than I thought. I've done a lot more arranging, way more than I thought. I've done a lot more writing. That creative writing class I took, so it's, and then just look at things that I didn't even remember I had taken. And I don't know, it's very, chasing what fascinates you. There's just so much value to that. I used to teach, and I'd love your input on this, although I'm not doing this anymore, so I guess it doesn't matter. But I taught for, I think, 8 or 9 years at DePaul University, and I did some music education. I taught bass too, and one of my teaching assignments was teach the jazz bass majors. I guess classical lessons for 2 years. It's kind of an old school model. They would have jazz lessons too. And man, I struggled so much with like, what is my value to this person here? What should I be doing? Should I be teaching them the Kusevitsky Concerto? Should I be teaching them technique? Because I knew the jazz lessons were a little bit more like life lessons. It was like, like more esoteric and not necessarily. So, and again, I'm not doing that anymore, but maybe someone listening is. And as any thoughts on like someone in that role, or like what because you have, it sounds like had a very, what I would think was like in terms of the bass, you're practicing Kusevitsky, you're playing Hindemith, you're doing a lot of, that's legit stuff, what?
I just realized I had my speakers on. You were blasting throughout my apartment. I didn't realize.
Oh, really?
Actually, you weren't that loud. So your question was in terms of teaching classical bass to
just
jazz
thoughts
majors?
on, I don't know. I never have a clear question about this topic. It's just something that I've thought a lot about, like what's, and it's kind of like going back to that, what did I use at Northwestern that was of value? Like in those jazz lessons that I was teaching, sometimes I would teach people straight up like what I would teach, like bow chops and vibrato and getting around. Sometimes I would I used to take improv lessons at Northwestern with a jazz pianist, Mike Coker. He taught me these Joe Daly lessons, and I would go through those. So I guess it's like a very general, like what would you have wished maybe somebody in my shoes had done, or like, just, I guess, thoughts on jazz education maybe in general.
It's so hard to say because everybody's different.
I know.
Everybody is a different path. I really think that it's the job of a teacher to just teach them what they know in terms of learning the instrument. And I think the more methodical the approach is, I think the better, because I think a lot of teachers get really hung up on teaching people how to play a certain style, and a lot of these students, like I have even some pretty advanced students that come to me and they don't really know the whole fingerboard yet. They have serious gaps. I know I had a lot of gaps in my playing when I moved to New York. I mean, by the time I was a senior, I was just learning to hear. I was just starting to really hear what I was playing when I was improvising. I was playing and pretending to play over forms and not really making the changes for years, because I kind of went from just studying all this classical stuff and doing some jazz on electric to suddenly playing jazz on upright as a freshman in college with people, and knowing right off the bat that I sort of know that tune and I sort of don't. And sometimes I'd be reading a tune and sometimes I would try not to read it. And I knew deep down there were a lot of things that were being glossed over in my playing. And I could play fast. I could sort of play in tune. And so I could kind of I could sort of hide some of these things sort of, but not really, in my playing. And I had a couple. And I had this great classical teacher, like I told you, Bob, who got me started on the fundamentals, and really, and that was invaluable, having that sort of foundation to my playing. And then I had the two different classical teachers in college, because I went all the way to Wesleyan for a semester, and they were working with me on, as my playing got better and I was starting to work on different repertoire and dealing with more musicianship and things, while they were getting me to start focusing on things like long tones and just getting more attuned to those sort of sound production issues. But like nobody was sitting down and saying, look, man, you got to get this together. Giving me the straight talk until, you know who Art Landy is?
That name rings a vague bell, but remind me.
He's a great piano player he lives in Colorado, but he went to Williams. He's the only famous jazz musician to go to Williams. And he came back and gave a couple workshops. He did a couple albums like on ECM. He played on one of Gary Peacock's records. And so he came and gave a couple workshops. And one day he sat down with me and I was like, yeah, man, I'm going to sit with Art and we're going to hang. And he's going to give me I'm going to get the real deal, like cool talk, jazz talk, with Art. And he just kind of sat me down and was like, your walking's really not together, is it? and I knew, and up until then, it was in the back, subconsciously, I knew that he was right. But I just in denial about it, and he just said, he's broke down. He said, you just sound like you're playing quarter notes and instead of like phrases. And what he was really getting at was that for me, I realized I just wasn't making all the connections that I was supposed to be making harmonically, and the forms were not really there. And there was a lot of things. So that summer, the following semester was when I went to Wesleyan and I got to study with Ed Blackwell, which was just life altering. And he was the first person that I played with that made me understand it's not about how good you are trying to sound when you're playing with other people. It's about how good you can make other people sound. He made me sound 100 times better of a bass player than I actually was. Like playing with him, the first time I played with him was like getting 100 bass lessons all at once. He made me understand things about my playing and just through the example of his playing. And I got to play with him every week and do some gigs with him. It was an unbelievable honor and gift. And so the following summer, I hooked up with a bass player named Cameron Brown, who I'd seen him play with Dewey Redman, because he had a lot of these things in his playing that I knew Art was talking about. And Cameron, in a much nicer way than Art did. Art gave me the tough talk, and Cameron gave me like the tough love, more like, he's like, yeah, I like the spirit of your playing, but there's certain things I was like, yeah, I know. So he's like, so just, he said, what I would do is just forget any of these other tunes, just go home and play a slow walking blues for a really long time. Don't try to do anything fancy, really, just focus on the pulse and the beat, and make sure that every note relates to the chord the way you want it to. Make sure you're hearing every note. And if you're not hearing it, slow it down even more. And basically I did that for 2 weeks. I pretty much did only that for 2 weeks, just play slow walking blues. And suddenly, just through the process of doing that, all this knowledge that wasn't of any use to me was suddenly like clicked in the middle of my brain in a way that made sense and had some kind of meaning to it. Like all these things I learned about chord function suddenly made sense. I could play suddenly, if I could hear the melody, I could suddenly play a tune in any key. But I just needed to slow down what I was doing and make some kind of connection between what I was hearing and what I was playing. And so that was incredible. He was one of the best teachers I ever had, just for making me do that. And every time I see him, like, we became pretty good friends, and we're sort of like colleagues. We would do some of the same gigs on the scene together. And every once in a while I run into him. He's like, I feel really bad. I really didn't know how to teach yet when you came to me for lessons. He was always surprised that I wanted to study with him. And I was like, are you kidding? It was the best lesson I ever had. I took about 6 lessons with him. I was always trying to do stuff that was above my pay grade before I was ready to,
Mm-hmm.
Like I was trying to learn tunes. I remember I had this teacher in high school that was trying to get me to learn how to play Boplicity, which is a tune from Birth of the Cool. And what he should have just been getting me to play like a 2-5-1 or just a blues, before, like I think he thought I was better than, like, more qualified than I actually was. So I don't know if this answers your question at all, but
no,
I think
for sure.
I think that whatever in any teacher has, and I mean, we can all learn from each other. Like I learn from, we all learn from our students. And I think that almost any jazz, especially a player at a jazz program nowadays, can seriously benefit from studying with just about any classical teacher. I mean, it is not, I had the benefit of having nothing but classical lessons for the whole first year that I was studying double bass, and I was doing it very, very diligently. And I know people who didn't have that, who were able to get their fingerboard thing together because they were much more diligent in a much more self-directed way. I wasn't at that age. I needed someone to tell me what to do and to show me the Simandl rules of shifting, which I knew that there was going to be exceptions to that, and I was going to probably change the rules down the road. But I needed someone to actually sit down and teach me all that thing. Only shift up on 4. Only shift down on. Only shift up on 1. Shift down on 4. Never shift up on 4. All those really, really rigid rules that they have in that stuff really make sense at the beginning when you're just learning the fundamentals of your instrument. Having someone lay that stuff out for you, I think, maybe you don't need to do Kusevitsky.
I came to that conclusion after a while, but unless they wanted to, unless that was like your jamming, that pursue what fascinates you, because some people really want to like go down that rabbit hole, and who knows what those influences will bring into their maybe just their life, and their enjoyment of life. But I get some really good advice from a tuba tubist. He was tuba professor at Northwestern named Rex Martin. And I was in an audition class of all things, but he was so holistic and said, he's like, listen, go to the Art Institute, go to concerts, go to lectures, go do all these things. And I noticed something interesting. I don't know if this is just me, but I noticed my fellow students in music school, there were people that sat in the practice room and practiced on Friday night. And that's what they did, right? It was like a badge of honor. They'd be there till 11 p.m. or whatever. And then there were the people that, I mean, they practiced, I'm sure, but they went to concerts and they played it. And I look at the careers of the people that stayed in the practice room all the time. Haven't heard of what so many of them did. The people that actually went, and I just noticed it because it was kind of you had to get on the train and go to downtown Chicago. It's not that big a deal, but it's easier to just sit at the practice room and I got 5 hours in, I got 3 hours in or whatever. And what just listening to you describe that reminds me both of Victor Wooten's book, The Music Lesson. Have you ever checked that out?
I heard about it. I haven't checked it out yet. Oh
man, you would. It is absolutely worth the read. If you heard, hey, Victor Wooten wrote a book, and you've ever seen Victor Wooten play, you would not expect that to be the book. I'll just say that. Yeah. And then I was chatting with Barry Green, who's a friend and colleague. He wrote The Inner Game of Music. Yeah. And Barry, I was at a master class with him in Mexico, maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. And we just talked about teaching in general. And then he just remarked, you never really teach anybody anything. All you can really do is point something out. And then he recommended Victor's book. Wow. But that's so true in a way. All you really, and I took that lesson to heart whenever I'm working with somebody, you're going to learn it. I can't get into your brain and make those connections like you did with that. That's I guess I just have to take a blues and go slow. Yeah. And I have all this knowledge, right? And then all of a sudden, that was the catalyst, right? That was the emulsifier for your knowledge.
Right. Well, it's like that adage, you can't play fast if you can't play slow.
Right.
It's such a cliche, but it's true. I mean, there's also the other thing the whole self-teaching versus teaching thing. Have you checked out any of Jeff Berlin's videos online?
I should. No, I haven't. I'm making a note to do that.
You know who Jeff Berlin is?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I remember I was really into Jeff Berlin when I was in high school. I got one of his records that I think Paul Gilbert played guitar on it. And that was kind of interesting to me because Paul Gilbert was from Greensburg, which is the next town over before he became this superstar. He's from, my mom knew his mom actually. So I was like, oh, Paul Gilbert. I've heard about this guy from my mom. He's on this Jeff Berlin record. So anyway, it's interesting because he's become this controversial figure in the world of bass education. And one of the things that I've had more time on my hands than I care to admit in order to do is just go down the YouTube rabbit hole. And I found a lot of his videos. And I kind of say, I don't know the whole history of his controversy and why he got banned from certain chat rooms or whatever. But I got to say, I find his approach to education really fascinating. His whole thing is teach, he's all about teaching musical content and only musical content. And I think what he means by that is written content. I'm not sure exactly what he means by that, but his whole thing is that we're all like Barry was saying, we're all self-taught. Mm-hmm. And there's certain things that should only be self-taught. Mm-hmm. So he's on this, he goes off on these sort of semi-diatribes again about how people Berkeley should not be teaching slap bass classes, for example. He thinks that's has no place. It's he's wasting students' money. And, but I started thinking about, well, what are the things that I'm trying to, if that's true, what can I teach that's of value? Because I'd like to become a better teacher. I'd always just like I'd like to become a better musician. As I get older, I have more and more people coming to me to study. Not that many still, but I enjoy teaching and I'd like to become better at it. So I was just trying to think, what are the things that I can teach that are of actual value? And one of the and I thought, well, having this young student, for example, I haven't cracked open the Samandel book in 30 years, but I started going through there and thinking, well, how would I approach teaching this? And what is my role here as his teacher? Mm-hmm. And like you said, we can only point them in the right direction and say, well, this is something to think about. And they still have to figure it out on their own.
Right.
the self-teaching part of it though is so crucial, and that's really out of our hands though. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, but especially when I was in college, I came from a small town. Like I said, I had barely listened to any music, and I was surrounded by people who weren't as serious musicians as I was in my freshman dorm. They didn't sit there practicing all the time, but they listened to so much more music than I had. They knew so much more about music, not just about rock and roll, but about jazz. Like there was a guy from Dallas, this guy, John, who I became pretty good friends with, who also played electric bass. And he had like 10 Monk albums. I didn't have one Monk album. And Monk is one of my top 5 favorite musicians now. And he introduced me to, the album Underground, which is one of the all-time great Monk quartet records. He also introduced me to Monk's music, which is the one that has Coltrane and Coleman Hawkins. First time I heard Wilbur Ware. And we sat around listening to music all the time. And sometimes someone would play something that we hated. There was a lot of Deadheads on our floor that used to play these horrible Grateful Dead bootlegs. But every once in a while, I'll be like, I got to admit, that's really great.
Yeah. Yep.
And I was never a big Dead fan, but I kind of like their records, but like the whole live Dead thing was always kind of lost on me. But just that whole concept of sharing music with people and like turning people onto things and everybody being into something else. And now, I don't mean to sound like an old fart, but when I go to these jazz programs, I do a lot of workshops. Like Matt Wilson's band, I've been playing in his band for about 20 years. Great drummer, a good friend of mine. And he does a lot of workshops at jazz programs across the country. And we'll be doing a lot of things where we'll play and have them play. And then we'll do a lot of things sitting around for half an hour talking, and answering questions. And usually at some point, someone will say, "What are you guys listening to?" And they're all listening to the same thing.
Oh,
they're all
interesting.
listening to like all the saxophone players are all checking out Chris Potter and Mark Turner, and all the bass players are checking out whatever the new Linda O, Christian McBride record is. And these are jazz programs, so they want to keep abreast of what's going on in the world. But I'm like, that's cool. Those guys are all great. You should all be checking those people out. They're amazing, But what else are you into? Like there will always be somebody who was into Frank Zappa.
Yeah.
And knew every Frank Zappa record. And I guarantee you none of those guys have checked out any Frank Zappa. Or I mean, maybe they have. But I mean, it's like, yeah. Not that there has to be that, but it's unnatural. We shouldn't all want to listen to the same thing. Everyone has a musical DNA. Our taste is made up of that. And that's who comes out when no matter, even if we're trying to copy somebody, a big part of what makes up our musical DNA is what we're listening to. And those influences come out in all the mistakes we make when we try to copy someone. So even if we try to copy them, we still sound like ourselves. But if we're all just listening to the same thing and not allowing that musical DNA to kind of flourish, I feel like we're doing ourselves a disservice. And that to me is a big part of what you're talking about, like going out to a museum, going to see a concert. Well, what concert are you going to? Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have to sit around. This is the great thing about, you don't have to talk to your teacher about this. You can if you want, but you can talk about it with your friends, your peers, or just do it on your own.
Well, and you're a great example of this, like with the SuperBigmouth and everything. Like if you just look at your all that Hendrix and the Who and Yes and all that. I mean, like, I'm listening to that album, and I'm not, we could talk for 5 hours about what jazz even means, that go down that rat hole. But I mean, I'm certainly not like, I feel like I'm listening to like that, was it Music of Jack Johnson or something like that? Maybe the close,
I wish I could make a record that good.
Well, but you know what? Hopefully, you know what I mean. It's just like that seems like an example of chasing what you've probably been chasing and been fascinated by. Another name that popped into my head when I was listening, for whatever reason, was Miles Mosley. And I don't know how familiar you are with Miles and his playing. He's in California, here in LA, but does a variety of things. But one thing he does is he's come up with this setup to play arco bass. I mean, it's kind of he kind of sound. Jimi Hendrix is probably the closest thing I would say to what he's doing.
Wow.
And he's like, it's again, under this umbrella of jazz, I would certainly that wouldn't be the stamp. That wouldn't be the genre I would pick in the iTunes store, for that. Right. But like nobody told this guy or taught him in music school to do that. It's a combination of all these different influences.
I know. And when you say jazz, I think the reason a lot of people gravitate to jazz is because it allows you to kind of go in any direction. And by the time I was playing, but by the time I was discovering the music, I mean, Miles had already made Jack Johnson.
Yeah.
Which, and countless other people had done and it's not really a genre bending thing. It's just that it's always absorbed whatever influences it wanted to. Yeah. Going back to, Jelly Roll Morton making that Spanish Tinge record. I forget what the song is, but he talks about it in his famous Library of Congress interview. First time someone talked about mixing Latin music and jazz, which had already been happening though. So in its very inception, jazz in itself was already a mixture of all this stuff that you could possibly imagine, coming through New Orleans and working its way up the Mississippi. And so I think that is something that has always attracted a lot of musicians to it. But I think music in general has always been like that. Classical music has always absorbed influences as well. It's not the same kind of thing that happened in the 20th century. And I think a lot of it had to do with, the advent of recording technology. Sure. and transmission of information that way. But I think, I listen to people, whether I'm listening to someone like Jimi Hendrix or Miles or Coltrane, I think, or Monk, one of the lessons is those guys absorbed influences. They had people that they loved, they had people that they copied, and then they also did whatever they wanted. That was one of the lessons. You can do whatever you want. And when I put my first band together, I remember I just did it just to see what would happen. I had no idea if it was going to be something I was going to continue doing. It was my quartet with Tony Malaby and Bill McHenry and Gerald Cleaver. I hadn't done a record yet. And one of the first gigs, I turned to Bill, because I remember I was in a lot of bands at the time, or worked with a lot of musicians who like to do a lot of deliberation. Should we do this next, or should we do that? What do you think would happen if we took the A section and put it on the other side of whether we're playing original tunes or coming up with arrangements of standards or whatever, and kind of doing it in a somewhat, academic way at times, in retrospect, if I cared to admit it, a little student-y in our approach. And at one point we're about to play it on the second set, and I turned to Bill and I said, and Bill had been leading a band more than I had at that point. And I said, do you think maybe it'd be okay if we played such and such second? And he goes, Chris, it's your band. You can do whatever you want. If you want to do it, do it. And I really always appreciated him telling me that, because it seems kind of obvious. I was like, that's true. What's the point? Yeah. If I can't just do it, my first instinct is, what am I worried that like 10 people are going to walk out of the Cornelius Street Cafe, Right. Like, just do it, And so that was really helpful. And I realized that I don't think of I look at the records that I've done, and there's a Superette aside, which is the one before this, which is an all electric band and had much more of an overt kind of rock sounding influence. I view the whole thing as sort of like a linear progression. But if I look back on it, I think, there's a lot of things that I allowed to go into the music that just seemed to work, and I just didn't even think about it. But I think that I was allowed to. I was told that I was given license to by a lot, not just Bill, but a lot of people in my life that have encouraged me and just kind of said, allowed me to give myself permission to do that. And, but to me, it's all just like, well, yeah, this is what the next thing that I'm going to do. It's just, I'm going to put Craig in the band now. I'm going to have electric piano, and I'm going to have him play organ, and we're going to do a piece where I'm going to play half the organ and he's going to play the other half of the organ, and I'm going to double guitar on top of it. Why not? I mean, that's what would sound good, So that was on the second to the last Big Mouth record. Yeah. And Craig didn't even bat an eyelash. He's like, oh yeah, totally. We'll do that. It'll be like the Arvo Part thing. I was like, what are you talking about? And he told me about, there was actually an Arvo Part organ piece where they had like 4 or 6 hand organs, all like like 2 or 3 people playing the same organ with specific parts for each hand. I was like, great, perfect, all right. And then when you work with people like Craig Taborn, you can they'll always allow you to take the music even further, because he's always thinking 10 steps ahead of wherever I am, because he's got that kind of mind.
Yeah. Well, it's such a valuable lesson, and it's something I think people are always waiting to ask permission, whether they're in school or or to be given permission. But that lesson, you can do whatever you want. I mean, that's like such a, and things look so much neater in the rearview mirror. If any of us look at our own careers, but in the moment though, it's like just try something, do it. Yeah. Don't perseverate about moving the A section or picking the second tune or moving things around. Just like
right. I mean, and it's not that. I mean, all you have to do is just be in that situation once or twice, and then it becomes the second nature, I think.
Yeah.
I was so nervous the first time I went into the studio where I was doing my own record. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster. I don't know what I'm doing. I'd made a bunch of records, not a whole lot, but I'd made a couple dozen records at that point when it was like 99. And I was like, well, how am I going to produce my own record? I don't even know what I'm doing. And I just went in and I was like, I just wanted to keep doing it all the time. Yeah. As soon as I was in there, it was just so fun to be in the situation where I could be like, okay, we're going to do this one next. Hey, whatever, you want to try this? And it before I knew it was over. And it just felt really, really easy. And one of the reasons that it felt easy is because I had such a great band. Mm-hmm. And I had musicians who understood where I was coming from, and we had a lot of mutual respect and trust for each other, and we'd played a lot of gigs. So that was a lesson about doing that, is that I always want to be playing with something that feels like, even if it's not an established project, I want it to feel like something where we're kind of sharing something together. Yeah. And we can, like the lesson I got from Blackwell, which is just to make each other, people that are focused on making the band and everyone around them sound better.
Yeah. Then you get that magic. You find the right collaborators, man. Everything becomes greater than the individual parts. It's like the magic of Well, what I thought would happen happened, which is we've scratched like 1% of what, because like we didn't talk about gear, which is the dirty little secret of my podcast, is I never talk about gear, even though some people say you should talk about gear. So we could talk, about that, or touring, life on the road, life in the recording studio. So if maybe we could put a pin in it here, and I would be honored if you want to do a round 2 or a round 3, next album that comes out, next anything that comes out. I think Danny Zeman, this younger bassist, holds the record. I think he's been on here 7 times at this point. But whenever gigs come back and touring comes back, I don't know if you make it out to the West Coast much, but
I've only made it out there once with my own band, but I'm out there a fair amount with other bands that I play in. I was going to ask you. SF Jazz is such a great venue, and I love playing there. Yeah. Who were some of the bands that you saw there?
I saw Katie Thoreau played with her trio, and I've only seen a few. I got to go to more. The last person I saw actually was Larry Grenadier doing a solo. Oh, right. The Gleaners solo in the Joe Henderson Lab. Which have you?
I've never played that. I've only played in the main space. Okay, and I did SF Jazz gigs before they had the facility as well.
Well, what a great facility. How cool. I love that the lab is open to the street so people can see music happening. And I was sitting in this Larry Grenadier concert. It's a Friday night and 8 p.m. And I'm thinking, how cool is this? I'm in one of the main performance venues in San Francisco, and it's a packed house. And what are we doing? We're listening to essentially a solo double bass recital. I mean, so that's a great place. That's a great place to see. Yeah.
And what a bass player.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Larry's such a great guy too. I mean, I met him in the late 90s. And I know you want to cut it off.
No, it's good. I want to be respectful of your time, but I'm just chilling. So
it's fine. I met him. I was hanging we were doing a bass hang, me and him and Ben Street. at Larry's apartment. And then our friend Jeff Ballard came and joined, and we were all hanging. And then I had to go. I forget why I had to leave, but I had a gig that night. And so I was doing the gig, and it was at this place, Augie's, and Larry and Ben both came. And then I was playing for a while, and I looked up, and there was 7 bass players all lined up at the bar. There was Dwayne Burno, the late Dwayne Burno was there. Santi Debriano was there. Ugana Okegwo, Greg August, and like 3 or 4 other guys I can't even think of. And I didn't think, I thought, oh, cool, there's a lot of bass players here. And then the saxophonist whose gig it was turned to me and goes, oh, no pressure, huh? And then I started to get really nervous, and I was like, thanks a lot, man.
Well, I was curious. Yeah. It
ended up being such an amazing bass hang, because I just met Larry that day. And that when we were hanging at his house, he found out I was a Wilbur Ware fan. He's like, oh, you're going to love this. And he found a play along record from the 1950s, like Music Minus One, like pre-Abersold play along record that Wilbur Ware was on. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. And he remembered how much I liked it. And later that week, he calls me and he said, hey, Chris, I don't know if you remember me. It's Larry Grenadier calling. And I want to let you know that I went back to Academy, which is the record store that I actually had worked at before. And he goes, and they had another copy of that play along record that Whoever Wears on. So I picked it up for you if you want to come by. So I went by his apartment. He gave me this record. I was like, here, can I pay you for it? He goes, no, it's okay. And I was like, man, what a guy. And every time I've run into him since then, we've had like the nicest, most awesome hang, and he's just the coolest. And I hadn't seen him in a long time, but I was just in Vitoria, this great festival, Vitoria Festival in Spain, and he was there playing with Danilo Perez and Abhishek Cohen, the trumpet player Abhishek Cohen, and I was there with Regina's band, and we had a nice hang there.
He's just that's the sweetest guy. But I love that doesn't surprise me that would be Larry. At his what a great person, and just it's been great getting to know him over the years. The few times that we've had a chance to hang out. But what a great. I was curious if that would make you nervous. I had a somewhat similar experience, a little different. But when I moved out here to San Francisco, I was new here, and I was doing this music festival, and in the audience in the front row was Rufus Reed, and then all these people in the classical world, Diana Gannett.
I met Diana. She used to teach at U of M.
Yeah, exactly. So
I went out and met her. I did a workshop there for a week one time, and I stopped by her office and introduced myself. Sorry, go ahead.
No, she's great. Well, so this concert, it was like my first. I'd moved here hoping to get work in San Francisco, and like this, I was on faculty with these people, which is like looking around, I was like, one of these people doesn't belong. You're this guy right here.
Oh, come on.
And so we were.
You were on stage.
I was on stage, but the first person to play was Diana Gannett playing solo Bach. Number 2,
amazing.
Me. And so then but you know what? That's something that maybe 10 years ago I would have been crapping my pants, but for some reason I just thought, like, you know what? That was beautiful, and now I'm going to share my music, which sounds super San Francisco, but I had this feeling of just like, you know what, we're all just making music, and here's what I do. And going back to talking about the like what you teach, this might be okay to wrap it up actually, but like going back to I was preparing for a clinic a few years ago, and I was talking with a colleague and trying to figure out, like, oh, I need to show them how to do this thing I did, and he said, no, don't approach it that way. Just say, here's what I do. Here's what I've tried. And when I decided, rather than trying to say, here's how you can do this thing, rather just turning and saying, like, here have been my experiences. Here are the things that I've tried, and the successes and failures, and things I've figured out. And I've approached other workshop clinics that way, and rather than trying to like create a to-do checklist for them, just like my experiences, and I've sort of taken that approach with my teaching. So that moment in the club where Larry Grenadier and a bunch of heavy hitters are lined up there, totally. I was able to flip that a little bit.
We all have our own thing that we bring to the table. It's no need to, but it's just human nature. I mean, that's the story about Charlie Hayden. Why he tells the story. Not that I'm comparing myself, but there was the story where the first time he played at the 5 spot with Ornette Coleman, he looked up the first night, and he looked at the bar, and it was standing at the bar was Mingus, Ray Brown, Percy Heath, like every one of his bass heroes. Yeah. He said that was when he started closing his eyes when he played. And after that, he never opened his eyes anytime he ever played again. Supposedly, that was the story.
That is I love that. Yeah.
That would be enough to make anyone close. I mean, I close my eyes a lot anyway, but you know, I know you want to wrap it up maybe, but
yeah.
Speaking of solo Bach, I've been working for the first time in years. I haven't played any classical bass in so long, like tried to work. I mean, and I just started because this whole thing with the quarantine and no gigs, so much of my practicing was just so freewheeling and so based on, like a lot of players, like based on what gigs I was doing, what music do I have to learn, and then sometimes I'd base my approach to practicing and whatever improvising I was doing, and it would be very specifically directed by what music I was playing. And so now I don't have any gigs. So what do you practice? Like that? I mean, I should ask you that too, but I mean, and so I just started off. Well, first I was just like, oh yeah, I can just keep doing the same approach. And then I realized, well, I don't have that anymore. And I realized I just wasn't practicing.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, this isn't working. So, so I have to be a lot more proactive about, you know, setting up projects for myself. And one of the things I did was I started transcribing stuff, which I hadn't done in a long time. It's transcribing electric bass, transcribing some James Jamerson, which is some stuff that I've always wanted to do more of, never felt justified time-wise to do, but now there's time. There's no justification at all left. So that's been fun. And also Tommy Cogbill, another great electric bass player that is one of my main focuses right now. I'm like really into this guy. Made a lot of records for Atlantic and stuff out of Muscle Shoals and New York, and guy from Memphis. And then so then I said, well, what if I started working on the Bach cello suites again, which I've never seriously worked on. I mean, I tried to work on the first prelude from the first one, and I was like, man, this is I without having a teacher directing me in any way, I felt like I was flailing. And so I went back and I started trying to do it again. And even my son was like, are you really trying to work on the Bach cello suites? Like, he thought it was hilarious. He'd never heard me try to do it. I was like, yeah, whatever. I used to try to do this before. Like, stop making fun of me. So then I said, well, what if I start working on one of the later things? And so I decided to start working on the minuet from the first one. And one of the things that always bugged me about those pieces is the transcriptions that I would be working from, and they never seemed. I couldn't get into them. And one of them I had, it was in the original key and original pitch, but it was all in tenor clef, which I hate reading.
Right.
And you know, I know the pieces well enough that I should be able to play them by ear, but I can't. So like, I don't have them memorized. And so I still need to go look at something. So I thought, well, what if I just look at the score, the original cello score? So, and I know that, of course, that's what bass players do. I didn't realize that. Is that how you worked on them?
Yeah, that's how, and I've done a variety of arrangements and looked at them, but I'm most comfortable just looking at the cello part and thinking up an octave. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it makes so much more sense. And what's so hilarious is that I actually was looking through this transcription that was in tenor clef, and I was trying, and I said, well, no, I'll just like put it into bass clef. And I probably should even admit this is really dumb. So I'm putting it into finale and bass clef, and then I think, well, this looks pretty ridiculous way up here, so I just better put it down an octave. I did the entire first half of the minuet, and then I looked at the cello scores. Oh, that's just
there's an easier way.
There's an easier way, and yeah, there's like 1,800 different versions of the cello score online you can just download.
Yeah.
So that's been fun though, because. And that's what I was going to say, that back to your original thing, if there is some classical music that you should work on with a jazz player, not everybody's into Bach, but it's kind of hard to find someone who doesn't appreciate Bach. And it's a great way to teach something that will very directly relate to their jazz playing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, every single bar is spelling out a chord pretty much, and then shows you how it relates to the next chord, and it's got voice leading and counterpoint inside it. But man, this has been so crazy working on this music now. I mean, I've had to slow it down so much, and it's been really good. And it's kind of taking me back to that whole, like, just hardcore musical content mode and not focusing, not trying to practice something that's going to that's relating to performance at all. You're just learning it for the sake of learning it. And that's kind of back to the Jeff Berlin approach. He's like, too many people are trying to perform when they practice. And then also people try to practice too much when they perform, you know? So this is something that like, well, I have no idea what this is going to do for me as a musician. I know it's going to make me a better musician in some way down the road. I know it's going to, you know, and no matter how in tune I think it is, I record it and I'm like, oh my God, is it terribly out of, I mean, you know, like no matter how much I slow it down and I get it really zoned in and dialed in, I realize how much the pitch is wavering. And so, man, this has been really eye-opening. And then going down the rabbit hole of like all the videos and master classes you can find on it. And then I remember there was a master class of Pablo Casal's teaching one of the movements from the first suite. Have you ever seen that?
No, I got to check it out. I'd love to check. Yeah, I'll dig around.
I can't find it. It's not on YouTube. But one time I remember while I was in France in the 90s doing a month-long run at a club, and the guitar player on the gig invited me over to his house one time. He had all these great videos, and one of them was this Pablo Casal's masterclass where basically they just worked on the first two notes for the first 20 minutes. He was going ba-bum. No, ba-bum. He was like, da-da. He was like, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, or whatever it is, you know.
Right.
And he wouldn't let him get past the first bar. He just kept on yelling at him. It's all about like just getting your interpretation right. And he's like, forget what's on the page. This is what he meant. Like that's basically his whole approach, you know.
It's cool. It's cool to dig into that though. And you know, we can't, and something with no like, oh, Saturday, it's got to be ready, you know, because we do work on something so differently that way versus we're just going down this path. I have been working on some pieces that I haven't had a real definite reason to play. And I have had a couple that I've been on the kind of back or medium burner for like a couple of years now. And they're I'll play them. I've got a gig theoretically booked in Dallas in December, a solo bass thing, and which I fully expect to be canceled. But let's just pretend it's happening.
Yeah, and that would be a safe assumption.
Well, it would be bad if it happened and I wasn't ready with the program. So So that's
you definitely have a deadline. That's awesome. But I have a gig booked with SuperBigmouth in Portugal.
Okay.
But,
yeah. So
I think they just announced that the EU is not going to let any Americans in, so that'll be interesting.
Right. Well, it's, you know, but like I've had other things that I could have played those pieces on, and I thought like, oh, that's not happening. But I think I've gotten to the point, and it's like, oh, you can teach an oldish dog new tricks. You know, like these pieces, these solo bass pieces that were doing things I'd never been taught, I'd never learned, and I was a little frustrated at first with them, but I was just thinking, I'm just going to put in some time every day. I use this practice app. That piece comes up. Maybe the goal is just get these two notes 8 times in a row to my satisfaction. Maybe the goal is record that one bar and actually think about what the next step is. And man, chiseling away at that, it's given me some self-confidence in my bass playing, and that I can improve, because I had many years where I was just like, I was playing the same pieces I've been doing for 20 years on any gig, because performing I do it, but that's like one of many things I do, and but it's been fun and refreshing, and that pace has accelerated a little bit, being locked away for the last 4 or 5 months.
No, it's great. What's interesting is my son heard me working on it after that, and he went from making fun of me to hearing me get better and better at it, enough to the point that, and he plays trombone, you know, and he said, his voice is deeper than mine. He goes, Dad, do you think maybe I could get a copy of those cello suites?
That's awesome.
So he's working on so I gave him the minuet. He goes, no, I want the first part, the first one. I was like, the prelude. He goes, yeah. I said, okay, cool. Here, go for it. But you know, interestingly enough, maybe on trombone it's easier.
In some ways,
you got the partials. You can you can probably do each bar in one position. I don't know enough about trombone to know, but you know, it's like you don't have to.
I know that they play the suites. And I know that an audition piece, the Saraband, I think, from the first suite is a popular, and or maybe probably multiple ones are on a trombone audition. But that, like, being more of an amateur at something, or just be like having that beginner's mind is so helpful. Like I film a lot of stuff. Like, another thing I've been doing in the quarantine is like trying to film a video for YouTube every week, and I hadn't done it for like 6 months, and I pulled it out, and I couldn't even remember the settings on the camera. I looked like a ghost. I was like, and then it was terrible, but I put it out. It's good. Document the process. The next one was a little bit better. The next one was a little bit better. And whether it's doing that or practicing Bach, or I imagine recording in the studio or anything, like it's good to even within our discipline of music, to have a beginner's mind to certain things.
Always, everything.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah.
I always want to have stuff to work on and improve. If I don't have stuff to work on, that means I'm just not noticing it's there. I know it's there. Yeah. So if I ever get to the point where I feel like, oh yeah, I figured that part out, like, then I know there's something wrong.
Right. That's a bad sign. Exactly. Exactly. Well, hey man, let's do a round 2 at some point. Definitely. If you're just say the word. Anything new that's coming up, especially like obviously like a new album or anything like that. And please, when you do make your way to the Bay Area next, let me know. And I live in North Beach. It's a great part of town. I'd love to take you out for a drink and hang out. And
you're on, man. I'll do it.
All right, cool.
Be careful what you wish for.
No, hey, no, I'm so glad we moved over here, because when people come in from out of town, there's so many good cafes and places around here. It's like, keep San Francisco weird. That's North Beach has succeeded. So,
well, yeah, I mean, that's a town that I know I would never be able to live in, but I love it. I love being able to visit. I mean, it's been unattainable for a long time.
Yeah, well, the only reason I live here is because of my wife. I'm the only bassist I know living in San Francisco. Everybody else is in Oakland and then getting priced out of there. Or well, we could do a whole podcast about.
Brooklyn's getting pretty bad.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, there's another. So on one of our next podcasts, we could just talk about, because I'm sure. Yeah, I'd love. Well, hey, I think I know where to send people. Like, I'll link up to your website and the albums and everything. Yeah, I think anything in terms of like a photo. Or anything, like I'll put bumper music at the beginning and end, which if you got something you want me to use, let me know. If not, no worries.
No, yeah, I can send you some stuff for sure.
Okay, cool, man. Chris, thank you so much for chatting. Folks, check out Chris's website and follow him on Facebook, Instagram, any streaming platform. I love the work that he's doing. So cool. And by the way, Chris was on Deep Tones for Peace. And if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know what that is. They are Mark Dresser, William Parker, and everybody associated with that, Fumiko Wellington. Actually, all 3 of those people have been on the podcast, some of them multiple times. Are putting out, are helping organize the bass community internationally to put out videos. I think it's 2 a day of people just playing music, just to bring the world together. It's a beautiful thing. We talked with Mark and William about that a few weeks ago, so go back and listen to that and check out Chris's performance. I think it's happening the day I'm recording this, which is not the day you're hearing it, but a few days before that. Did I mention, I got to remember to do this in the intro, that I have a course out with Discover Double Bass? No, I did not. And if you're at the end here, you probably listen to this podcast regularly, so I'll just be brief. If you want to check that out, discoverdouble.bass.com, and we have it linked up to in the show notes on the website, all that kind of good stuff. But it was such a pleasure to do that. Really, really cool. What else is going on? We've had incredible smoke here in California, which you're going to be hearing about on later podcasts, and you are probably aware that the West Coast has been having bad fires, but the last few days have cleared up, and it's so many things, when they're taken away from you, you realize how much you take them for granted, and we've certainly had that kind of smoke here before, but it's been extremely bad. We had one day where the sun never rose. It looked like Mars here. So it's so nice to be able to actually go outside and look across and see see Oakland, which I hadn't been able to see for forever. I live here in San Francisco, so it's normally not a challenge to see Oakland, but and be able to go out and go on a run and take my dog William for runs, and my wife and I go sit on the waterfront. So I'm going to do some more of that today. It's a Friday here, closing out the week, so this is my last scheduled activity for the day. So I'm going to end this outro and thank the team. Thank you so much to Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Mitch Mooring, Trevor Jones, and Krista Copper. Mitch makes beautiful basses just east of the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Kilgore, Texas. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. Thank you, Chris, for doing this episode. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.